Daniel stood at the firing line, the pistol loose in his grip. To the watching guards he looked nervous, uncertain. He seemed to fumble with the safety mechanism and took an unusually long time to line up his first shot. "Take your time, Harrison," Blake called out mockingly. "We've got all night." The first shot rang out. Daniel appeared to stumble slightly from the recoil, and several guards exchanged knowing looks. When they checked the target, the bullet had hit the outer ring, barely acceptable for qualification. "Beginner's luck," Carter whispered to the guard next to him. "Watch him miss the target completely now." Daniel fired his second shot. This one hit closer to the center, but still nothing impressive. The guards began to lose interest, some already discussing where they'd go for drinks after the session ended. Shot after shot, Daniel maintained a steady but unremarkable performance. His grouping was acceptable, his stance looked textbook but awkward, and his timing suggested someone still getting comfortable with the weapon. "Well, at least you'll pass qualification," Sergeant Mitchell said when Daniel finished his 20 rounds. "Not winning any competitions, but you won't embarrass the regiment either." Daniel nodded quietly and began to pack up his equipment, but Blake wasn't finished with him yet. "Hold on there, Harrison. Didn't you hear Mitchell earlier? We're doing 50 meters too." Blake grinned at his colleagues. "Unless you think that's too challenging for your first time." The challenge hung in the air. Daniel could have declined, the 50-meter round was optional, but something in Blake's tone made him pause. He looked at the corporal for a long moment. "I'll give it a try," Daniel said quietly. The group moved to the 50-meter range. The targets looked impossibly small from this distance, especially under the artificial lighting. Even Blake typically struggled at this range, though he'd never admit it publicly. "Right then," Blake announced, stepping up first. "Let me show you how it's done, Harrison." Blake took his time, using the breathing techniques he'd learned over his 20-year career. His first shot hit the target, though well outside the center rings. His second shot was better, and by his fifth shot, he'd managed to land one close to the bullseye. When he finished, Blake had managed a respectable grouping, with 2 shots in the inner rings and the rest scattered around the center of the target. "Not bad for the old eyes," he said, clearly pleased with himself. "Your turn, rookie." Daniel walked to the firing line and loaded his magazine. The other guards had gathered closer now, curious to see how badly the new guard would perform at the more challenging distance. He raised the pistol and seemed to struggle finding his stance. The weapon wavered slightly in his grip, and he took several deep breaths before firing his first shot. The bullet struck the target low and to the right. Several guards chuckled. "Keep both eyes open, Harrison," Carter called out. "And don't hold your breath so long." Daniel fired again. This shot was closer to center, but still nothing special. He continued methodically, each shot seeming to require significant concentration and effort. But by his 7th shot, something began to change. The impacts were creeping closer to the center of the target. His 8th shot landed in the inner ring. "Getting lucky now," Blake muttered, though his voice carried less confidence than before. Daniel's 9th shot hit even closer to center. His 10th and final shot struck just outside the bullseye, creating a final grouping that was surprisingly tight for someone who'd seemed so uncomfortable moments earlier. The range fell quiet as they examined the target. What had started as scattered, amateur shooting had gradually evolved into something much more precise. "Well," Sergeant Mitchell said slowly, "that was unexpected." Blake stared at the target, then at Daniel. "Lucky streak, I suppose. Still not as good as my group, though." But there was uncertainty in his voice now, and Daniel was looking at the 50-meter target with an expression that none of them could quite read. "Same time next month, then?" Daniel asked quietly, setting down the pistol. The question sounded innocent enough, but something about the way he asked it made Blake uncomfortable. Word spread quickly through the palace guard ranks about Daniel's improving marksmanship. What should have been a minor training incident became the subject of mess hall conversations and corridor gossip. "I'm telling you, something was off about the whole thing," Carter insisted to a group of guards during their morning break. "First half of his shots looked like a complete amateur. Then suddenly he's hitting the center like he's been doing it for years." Sergeant Mitchell overheard the conversation and frowned. He'd been thinking about the same thing since the previous evening. The progression from Daniel's early shots to his final grouping seemed too dramatic to be natural improvement. "Maybe the lad just needed to warm up," Mitchell suggested. though his tone suggested he didn't entirely believe it himself. "Warm up for what?" Blake interjected, joining the group. "I've been shooting for 20 years, and I've never seen anyone improve that much in 10 shots. Daniel arrived for his shift and could sense the tension immediately. Conversations stopped when he passed, and he caught several guards staring at him with newfound curiosity. During the morning ceremony, Daniel noticed Blake watching him more closely than usual. The corporal's eyes followed his every movement, searching for something that might explain the previous night's performance. At lunch, Daniel sat alone as usual, but the isolation felt different now. Instead of being ignored, he was being studied. Harrison Blake approached his table uninvited and sat down across from him. "Mind if I ask where you served before joining the Palace Guard?" Daniel looked up from his meal. "Standard infantry training, then civilian work for a few years before this position." "What kind of civilian work?" "Security, private sector." Daniel's answers were brief, offering no additional information. Blake leaned back in his chair. "Security work, eh? That might explain the shooting. Lot of private security companies train their people well these days." "Some do," Daniel agreed, neutrally. But Blake wasn't satisfied. Something about Daniel's demeanor bothered him. The man was too controlled, too careful with his words. Most guards loved talking about their previous experiences, especially the younger ones trying to impress their colleagues. That afternoon, Blake made a decision that would change everything. He approached Sergeant Mitchell in private. "I want to do some checking on Harrison's background." Mitchell raised an eyebrow. "What kind of checking?" "His service record, his references. Something doesn't add up about that man." "Blake, the Palace Security Office already cleared him for duty. His background check was thorough." "Maybe too thorough," Blake replied. "Sometimes when a file looks perfect, it's because someone made sure it looks perfect." Mitchell considered this. He'd had similar thoughts but hadn't wanted to voice them. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that our quiet new guard might not be who he claims to be." Meanwhile, Daniel was finishing his afternoon shift when he noticed Blake talking quietly with several other guards. Their body language suggested serious discussion, and their occasional glances in his direction confirmed his suspicions. He'd known this moment would come eventually. His shooting performance the previous night had been a mistake. He'd allowed his natural skills to surface when he should have maintained his carefully constructed persona. After changing out of his uniform, Daniel walked through London's busy streets to a small cafe he'd discovered months earlier. He ordered tea and sat in a corner booth where he could watch the entrance. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Your cover may be compromised. Recommend immediate extraction." Daniel deleted the message and finished his tea. He wasn't ready to leave yet. This job meant something to him, even if he couldn't explain exactly what. But as he walked back to his small flat, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that Blake was the type of man who wouldn't let things go. The corporal had the look of someone who enjoyed solving puzzles, and Daniel had just become his most interesting challenge. That night, Daniel lay awake staring at the ceiling. He'd spent years learning to blend in, to become invisible in plain sight. But one moment of carelessness at a shooting range might have undone everything. The question now was whether Blake would dig deep enough to find the truth. And if he did, what Daniel would do about it. Some secrets were worth protecting, no matter the cost. Blake arrived at work early the next morning with a folder tucked under his arm. He'd spent most of the previous evening making phone calls and pulling in favors from old military contacts. "Find anything interesting?" Sergeant Mitchell asked, noticing the determined look on Blake's face. "Maybe," Blake replied, opening the folder. "Harrison's service record is clean. Too clean. Basic infantry training, satisfactory performance ratings, nothing remarkable." "That sounds normal enough."
"That's the problem."
"It sounds exactly like what someone would create if they wanted to appear normal." Blake pulled out a photograph. "Look at this training photo from his basic course." Mitchell studied the image. It showed a group of new recruits during a field exercise. Daniel was in the back row, barely visible among the other soldiers. "Notice anything?" Blake asked. Mitchell looked closer. "He's standing differently from the others, more alert, like he's watching for threats even during a training exercise." "Exactly. And look at his equipment placement." Blake pointed to Daniel's gear. Everything's positioned for quick access. Most recruits are sloppy with their kit placement, but Harrison's arranged like someone who's seen real combat. Mitchell was beginning to understand Blake's suspicions, but he still had doubts. This could all be coincidence, Blake. Maybe the lad just took his training serious. Maybe, but I made some calls to people who work in the private security sector. Nobody's heard of the company Harrison claims to have worked for. This got Mitchell's attention. What do you mean? Redstone Security Limited. According to Harrison's file, he worked there for 3 years. I called around. Nobody in the industry knows of any company by that name. Meanwhile, Daniel was beginning his morning shift, unaware that his carefully constructed background was being dissected piece by piece. He took his position outside the palace, maintaining the stoic expression required of his role. But he noticed things. Blake was absent from the morning formation. Sergeant Mitchell kept glancing in his direction during the briefing. 2 guards he'd never spoken to before made eye contact with him and quickly looked away. During his lunch break, Daniel made his own phone call. It's Harrison. I think we have a problem. The voice on the other end was calm and professional. Explain. One of the guards is asking questions about my background. He's the persistent type. How much does he know?
Hard to say.
That he's military police background. He knows how to investigate. There was a pause. We can arrange your extraction within 24 hours. Not yet. I need more time. Harrison, if your cover is blown. I said not yet. Daniel ended the call and returned to his post. That afternoon, Blake made his boldest move yet. He approached Daniel directly during a quiet moment. Harrison, I've been thinking about your shooting performance the other night. That was quite an improvement over the course of 10 shots. Daniel kept his expression neutral. Practice makes perfect, I suppose. Yes, about that practice. Where exactly did you train with Redstone Security? The question hung in the air. Daniel felt his muscles tense slightly, but his face remained calm. Various locations. We moved around quite a bit depending on the contracts. Interesting work, private security. Must have seen some action. Some, Daniel replied carefully. Blake nodded slowly. I tried to look up Redstone Security Limited online. Couldn't find much information about them. Small company. They kept a low profile. Must have been very low profile. I called around to some contacts in the industry. Nobody's heard of them. Now Daniel did react. Just slightly. His eyes met Blake's for a moment longer than usual. Perhaps you didn't speak to the right people. Perhaps not, Blake agreed. Or perhaps Redstone Security Limited never existed. The accusation was direct and unmistakable. Daniel weighed his options quickly. He could maintain his cover story, but Blake clearly wasn't going to let this go. He could request immediate extraction, but that would mean abandoning a mission he'd spent months preparing for. Or he could take a third option. Corporal Blake, Daniel said quietly, I think you and I need to have a private conversation. Blake felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in Daniel's tone that suggested this conversation would be very different from what he'd expected. What kind of conversation? Blake asked. Daniel looked around the courtyard, ensuring they weren't being overheard. The kind where you learn why asking questions about certain people can be dangerous. The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and for the first time since beginning his investigation, Blake wondered if he'd made a serious mistake. Blake met Daniel in a quiet pub 3 blocks from the palace that evening. The older guard arrived first, choosing a corner table where they could speak without being overheard. His hands were slightly unsteady as he ordered a pint, the weight of Daniel's implied threat from earlier still fresh in his mind. Daniel arrived precisely on time, scanning the room automatically before joining Blake at the table. He ordered tea instead of alcohol, another small detail that Blake filed away. You wanted to talk, Blake said, trying to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, studying the older man's face. 20 years in the military police, 3 commendations for investigative work. Divorced, 2 children you see every other weekend. Blake felt his blood run cold. How do you... You have good instincts, Blake. But sometimes good instincts can get people hurt. Are you threatening me? Daniel shook his head. I'm trying to protect you. And myself. Blake leaned forward. Then tell me who you really are. Another long pause. Daniel seemed to be weighing something important in his mind. Finally he spoke. "My name is Daniel Harrison. That part is true, but everything else in my file," he shrugged. "Let's say it's a simplified version of the truth. Redstone Security Limited doesn't exist, never did." Blake felt a mixture of vindication and growing concern. "Then what's your real background?" Daniel looked around the pub again, ensuring their conversation remained private. "I can't tell you specifics, but I can tell you that my previous work required certain skills. Skills that occasionally surface despite my best efforts to suppress them."
"What kind of skills?"
"The kind that make someone very good at shooting, among other things." Blake was beginning to understand. "You're not really a palace guard, are you?" "I am now. That's all that matters." "But you weren't always." Daniel met his eyes directly. "No, I wasn't always." The admission hung between them. Blake felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that one more step would take him somewhere he might not be able to return from. Why the palace guard? Why this job? Daniel was quiet for so long that Blake wondered if he would answer at all. Sometimes people need to disappear for a while. Sometimes the best place to hide is in plain sight, wearing a uniform that makes you invisible to everyone around you.
Hide from what?
From people who might want to ask questions about things I've done, places I've been, people I've met. Blake felt his heart racing. What kind of people? Daniel's expression hardened. The kind you don't want to meet, Blake. The kind who solve problems permanently. The threat was clearer now, and Blake realized he'd stumbled into something much bigger than he'd imagined. But his investigative instincts wouldn't let him stop. The shooting range. You were holding back deliberately. Yes. Because showing your real skills would have raised questions. Yes. But you slipped up toward the end. Daniel nodded. I got comfortable. Made a mistake. Blake leaned back in his chair, processing everything he'd heard. So what happens now? That depends on you. What do you mean? Daniel leaned forward slightly. You can forget this conversation ever happened. You can stop asking questions about my background. You can let me do my job quietly until it's time for me to move on. And if I don't... Daniel's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Then you'll force me to make some difficult decisions. Blake felt sweat forming on his forehead. You're talking about killing me. I'm talking about protecting myself. And you're talking about getting yourself into a situation that could end very badly for everyone involved. The two men stared at each other across the small table. Blake realized he was at a crossroads. He could push further and risk consequences he couldn't imagine, or he could back down and let sleeping dogs lie. But there was one more question he had to ask. At the shooting range, when you were holding back those first shots, then gradually getting better, that wasn't natural improvement, was it? Daniel shook his head. You were giving us a demonstration, showing us what we expected to see, then slowly revealing just enough skill to make it believable.
Something like that.
Blake felt a chill. Just how good are you really? Daniel stood up from the table. Better than you want to know, Blake. Much better. As Daniel walked away, Blake remained seated, staring into his half-empty pint. He'd gotten the answers he'd been looking for, but now he wished he'd never asked the questions. 3 days passed in uncomfortable tension. Blake had returned to work, but avoided Daniel entirely, while Daniel continued his duties with the same quiet professionalism he'd shown since arriving. But both men knew their conversation in the pub had changed everything. Sergeant Mitchell noticed the strange dynamic immediately. What's going on between you and Harrison? He asked Blake during a private moment. Nothing, Blake replied too quickly. Just personality differences. But Mitchell wasn't convinced. He'd seen Blake obsess over mysteries before, and the corporal's sudden lack of interest in Daniel seemed forced and unnatural. The situation came to a head on Friday evening when the monthly shooting qualification was scheduled again, an extra session that Mitchell had arranged after several guards had requested additional practice time. Daniel tried to excuse himself from the session, claiming he had other commitments, but Mitchell made attendance mandatory for all personnel. Something wrong, Harrison? Blake asked as they prepared to leave for the shooting range. It was the first time he'd spoken directly to Daniel since their pub conversation. Nothing at all, Daniel replied, but his jaw was tight. At the shooting range, the atmosphere was different from the previous session. Word had spread about Daniel's unexpected improvement, and several guards who hadn't been present the first time had come specifically to watch him shoot. "Quite the audience tonight, Harrison," one of the newer guards commented. "Heard you gave everyone a surprise last time." Daniel signed in and collected his equipment without responding. He could feel the weight of expectation from the gathered guards, and worse, he could see Blake watching him with careful attention. The first round went much as before. Daniel shot adequately but not impressively, maintaining his carefully constructed persona of a competent but unremarkable guardsman. "Bit disappointing after all the stories we heard," muttered one of the spectators. But Blake wasn't satisfied. As the group prepared to leave, he spoke up. "What about the 50-meter range, Harrison? That's where you showed real improvement last time." Daniel felt trapped. Declining would seem suspicious, but accepting would risk revealing more than he wanted to show. "I don't think that's necessary tonight," Sergeant Mitchell intervened. "We've completed the required qualification." "Just for practice," Blake pressed. "I'm curious to see if Harrison can repeat his performance." The challenge was unmistakable. Daniel realized that Blake was testing him, trying to force him into a corner where he'd have to either reveal his true capabilities or find a way to decline that wouldn't raise more questions. "Fine," Daniel said quietly. "One round at 50 meters. The group moved to the longer range. Daniel loaded his weapon and took his position at the firing line. He could feel every eye in the room focused on him. He raised the pistol and fired his first shot. It struck the target well off center, exactly what everyone expected from his previous performance. His second shot was closer to center. His third, closer still. But then something happened that Daniel hadn't planned for. One of the fluorescent lights above the range began flickering erratically, creating strobing shadows across the targets. For most shooters, this would have been a significant distraction, but Daniel's training kicked in automatically. His breathing steadied, his grip adjusted, and his focus narrowed to exclude everything except the target. His fourth shot struck the inner ring. His fifth hit just outside the bullseye. "Bloody hell," someone whispered. But Daniel wasn't finished. The flickering light had triggered something deeper than conscious thought. Years of training under adverse conditions, in situations where a missed shot meant death. His sixth shot hit dead center. His seventh shot struck so close to the sixth that the impacts nearly overlapped. The range fell completely silent. Daniel fired his remaining 3 shots in rapid succession, each one striking within inches of his previous shots. When the shooting stopped, the silence stretched for long seconds. Then Blake spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's not possible." Daniel set down the weapon and turned to face the group. Every guard was staring at him with expressions ranging from amazement to suspicion to fear. "What exactly are you?" Sergeant Mitchell asked. Daniel looked at each face in the room, knowing that his carefully maintained cover was now completely blown. The flickering light had caused him to react instinctively, and his true capabilities were now on full display. Blake stepped forward, his earlier fear replaced by grim satisfaction. "I know what he is," he said. "The question is, what are we going to do about it?" Daniel stood perfectly still, calculating his options. The room contained 8 armed guards, 2 exit points and no windows. The odds weren't impossible, but they weren't good either. And then Sergeant Mitchell did something unexpected. He began to clap slowly. "Gentlemen," Mitchell said, "I think it's time we had a proper conversation about what we've just witnessed." The shooting range felt smaller, with 8 men standing in a circle, all eyes fixed on Daniel. Sergeant Mitchell continued his slow clapping until the sound echoed off the walls, then stopped abruptly. 27 years in the Army," Mitchell said quietly. "I've seen competition shooters, Olympic marksmen, and the best snipers the military has to offer. What we just witnessed," he shook his head, "that wasn't training, that was something else entirely." Daniel remained silent, his hands loose at his sides, ready for whatever came next. Blake stepped forward. "Tell them what you told me, Harrison. About Redstone Security Limited." "What about it?" asked Carter, looking confused. "It doesn't exist," Blake said. "Never did. Our quiet friend here has been lying about everything since day one." The other guards began murmuring among themselves, but Mitchell raised his hand for silence. "Here's what I think happened," Mitchell continued, walking slowly around Daniel as he spoke. "Someone with very specialized skills needed to disappear for a while. Someone who's spent years in situations where missing a shot gets you killed. Someone whose muscle memory is so ingrained that even when he's trying to hold back, stress makes his real abilities surface. Daniel finally spoke. "What do you want, Mitchell?" The truth would be a start. Daniel looked at each man in the room, weighing his options. He could continue lying, but his shooting performance had made that almost impossible. He could fight his way out, but these were good men who didn't deserve to be hurt. Or he could take the biggest risk of all. He could trust them.
For sure.